All right, welcome back, everybody. In this lecture, we're going to be continuing down the road of exploring this concept of the self. But what we're going to be doing this time is not necessarily talking about how we establish a general sense of the self and of how complex it is in our minds and how that might play a role in what's activated in different social situations. Instead, what we're going to be doing is focusing on whether or not this self that we've formed is something that's malleable. Is it something that can shift in different environments over time and maybe with the right combinations of cues? And the importance of covering this shifting self is because when looking at the self again, we argued it's really something that can be a catalyst behind our behaviors. So if it is altering, it does matter, but the environment matters, that is, well, then we want to know what environmental cues might actually shift the self. To appreciate this better, I want us to understand of what the self is used for in any situation. Most social psychologists would argue that once we've defined a self, if we're going back to what we had in our last lecture, once we've kind of attuned to a social self that we're evoking in a specific situation, we might theoretically use that self, that definition of who we are, to determine what it is we're going to do in that situation, how we're going to make sense of things, how we're going to interpret it, and kind of which person we're going to be in that environment. This also tends to project into the type of person we want others to see us as. It relates to something that we call self-presentation. We're going to talk a little bit later in this lecture how important self-presentation is to us, that we want people to see us the way we see ourselves. But just understand right now that essentially once we've activated a self in a certain social situation, we're not only using that self we've activated to guide us, but we tend to use it to guide our attempts to have others see us in a specific way. And if we do get to a situation where our actions maybe do or don't align with that perception of the self, it also leads to another thing that we call self-justification, and giving a reason for why we're doing certain things that either align or don't align with the self that we see our person as. And we're going to talk about this idea of self-justification actually in our next module. Get into it a lot more and use that also as a segue into another topic of persuasion. But before we get to all that, let's unravel again this thing that we call the shifting self. So to understand the shifting self, we have to understand some of the things that we use during that introspection process that we talked about last time to determine who we are and what we're like in any given situation. And one theory that gives us a really good sense of what we could be doing when we're introspecting and kind of trying to figure out what we're like is a theory called the self-perception theory. It's this notion that when we do introspect, when we have this moment of pause to figure out what we're like, what we often do is look at our behaviors. In particular, our behaviors that we think are attuned to that specific situation. And we use those behaviors that we can recall as good indicators of what our self is like. Now, it's important to reiterate something we talked about in the last lecture, and that's the fact that we're not often introspecting. Right? More often than not, we're probably just knee-jerk reacting to many situations and not using that as an indicator of the self or using that as a means of introspecting. But nonetheless, when we are forced to introspect, when we are forced to think about what we prefer, or who we are, what we're like, or how we want to present ourselves to others, well, this self-perception theory can give us some sense of what we're using. Again, we use our behaviors, and we also theoretically use, and this is an extra component to it, our ability to recall instances of us acting in a specific way if we think we are a certain type of person. So let's say I think of myself as relatively nice with my friends. Well, if I'm forced to introspect, the self-perception theory would say that I would look at if I've been nice and also how easily it is to recall situations where I have been nice around my friends. If I'm suddenly caught at a loss trying to find situations where I've been nice to my friends, I might at that point, according to this theory, reassess. Am I really a nice person around my friends? Is that something that defines me in that specific situation? This seems like a very intuitive thing, right? We should think about our behaviors and how easily we can recall things about ourselves to gauge what it is we're like in these different social contexts. But because we do this, we can sometimes be sort of thrown off through specific types of manipulations. And it relates to a concept in cognitive psychology that is definitely something that is a key component to social psychology as well, something called the availability heuristic, where we essentially judge the likelihood of something or the propensity of something based on how easily that thing can come to mind. It might sound a lot like the self-perception theory, and it should be recognized as something that's very closely tied to it. One classic example of how this availability heuristic could change our perception of the self was a study done back in 1991 by a researcher named Schwartz and a number of colleagues that also contributed. In this study, they asked participants to come in and list their number of times they'd done certain things, and then after they listed the number of times they'd done certain things, they were asked to assess how much of a specific trait which related to those things they possessed, on a scale of 1 to 10 or something. In this study, Schwartz and others varied the number of events that people were asked to recall. So some people would come in and they'd be asked, recall 3 times that you were outgoing. Recall 3 times that you were studious. Recall 10 times that you were adventurous. These were the types of questions that people were asked. And what they did to really highlight some of the effects that they looked at was they varied how many times people were asked to recall certain events. So some people were, say, when looking at studiousness, asked to recall 3 times that they were studious, and other times they were asked to recall 10 times that they were studious. And then again, after Schwartz asked for people to recall these these examples, they were then asked to report levels of how much they possess a specific characteristic. And what they found in this study was that there was a shift in the propensity of levels that people reported when they were asked to recall varying amounts of times. It didn't mean that somebody who was an introvert, when asked to only report 3 times that they were extroverted, suddenly thought of themselves as the most social individual in the world. And it doesn't mean that extroverts who were asked to recall 10 times that they were extroverted were suddenly now thinking of themselves as introverted because they couldn't come up with exactly 10 times. But it does indicate that there is a bit of a shift. That if things come to mind easily, and usually we can think of 3 times even if something is counter to our own typical behaviors, think of 3 times where we've done something that indicates a behavior or a trait, we might bump ourselves up just a little bit. Right? Even if you don't necessarily think of yourself as very mean, I'm guessing you can recall 3 times where you were mean. If you don't think of yourself as very mean, or maybe you do think of yourself as pretty mean, it still might be challenging to come up with 10 concrete times in the recent couple days where you were mean to another individual. And that ability to recall those things relates to the availability heuristic, and we think it can tweak our perceptions of who we are. So going back to the grand scheme of things here, what it means is that when we're introspecting, if we're given specific prompts, like recall a bunch of times that you did this, we could actually shift, maybe temporarily, maybe for the long run, our interpretations of ourselves based on how easily we can access specific memories of us doing certain things that relate to a trait or preference or some type of attitude. And this gives us a big sense that when judging the self, there might be some inaccuracies. There might be some things that sort of tip the scales in different directions. And it also leads this question of, is there anything else that's tipping the scales in different directions? So to highlight this effect, I always like to have an in-class activity where people not only replicate the study that we just spoke about, but we also replicate a really interesting study that seems very simple on the surface. It asks people to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10 in comparison to their peers in the classroom right now, not peers all over the world, but just peers in the classroom right now. where they lie with respect to the traits that you see listed on the right. Mathematical abilities, athleticism, trustworthiness, thoughtfulness, potential for success, creativity, persistence, friendliness. Usually I pepper in a couple more when we're doing this as an in-person activity to give it a little bit more breadth, but just for brevity's sake and the fact that we don't have much space on the slides, we're going to stick to just those characteristics. And we can do this. I encourage you to do this. Rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 on these different dynamics. We just can't share this information about these 8 different things with our classmates. If you've done that, my guess as you look through this is that your average on all 8 of these is going to be much higher than 5. Now, maybe you are slightly above average on every one of these characteristics, or maybe you're way above average on every one of these characteristics, minus, say, 1 or 2. But if we aggregate all the responses of the class, what we'll find is a really interesting effect, and it pertains to this idea of the sense of self being tweaked. Even though I specifically said, I want you to rate yourself in comparison to your peers in the classroom, we probably would not find, unless this is the most freakish random occurrence ever, an average score for all of these different things at around 5. Instead, the average score on pretty much all 8 of these characteristics would probably be somewhere between 7 and 8. And in fact, for potential for success, I usually see the average shoot up to between 8 and 9, with maybe just one holdout not putting themselves above 5 on that specific category. This leads to the obvious question of, well, how does that happen and why does it matter? Well, what this relates to is this idea of something that we call the self-enhancement bias. Our tendency to not only want others to see us in a good light, but a tendency to want to be a relatively positive person, a person that is admired. We can sort of relate this to early personality theories that suggested that all of us had this need. It was proposed by a researcher named Alfred Adler, this need to be seen as a positive, valuable individual in society. Now, the self-enhancement bias, just from a purely scientific perspective, suggests that when we're asked to rate ourselves, even if there's a specific constraint given, in comparison to your friends or your peers or whatever, we tend to see people inflate themselves a little bit. Now, what this produces is what we just saw called the above average effect. And how it's maintained is an interesting story. Numerous studies have shown that when we do see contradictory evidence to kind of the feelings we have about ourselves or the ratings we give ourselves, we often engage in lots of, and I hate to use the term, but things that are sort of like defense mechanisms. You won't see me using many Freudian terms in this class, so embrace it if you love him, and just understand I won't do that again if you don't. But that's sort of what relates to what we see as social psychologists when people do encounter conflicting evidence to their own perceptions. What people will often do when they see that maybe they didn't do as well on an exam as they'd like and they thought themselves as pretty good students is they find people that are sort of like them but did worse and use that information as an indication that they're maybe not quite as bad as their exam performance might indicate. As a collective, what social psychologists have found is, and when we rate how high or low we are on certain things, we don't look at everybody in the population. We tend to look at our peers, as we talked about, and especially the peers that we think of as just a little bit less in possession of certain characteristics that we define as good or something that we would like to be seen as. A classic example is the person who's asked how good they are at basketball, and instead of assessing how good they are in comparison to, say, everybody else in the world, they look at their peers that are maybe extremely unathletic or maybe extremely athletic and use them as a gauge as to how good they are at that particular sport. That's what downward social comparison is all about. Now, if you're wondering whether or not we go beyond that sometimes, there does seem to be some evidence that we do. When we're striving to become something, when we're looking to become elite, there is this technique called upward social comparison that can be a motivator when we do find ourselves kind of in the upper echelons of groups that when we still would like to get higher up. Now, upward social comparison can be seen as a means of kind of getting to a specific level, but it's also sometimes, again, seen as a pseudo-defense mechanism, where if we don't do well in a test, sometimes we might say, well, look at these brilliant individuals like Albert Einstein and Bill Gates and other people who weren't necessarily extremely successful in these early math classes that they took. And maybe it's not an indication of me not being the person that I'd like, it's just a poor gauge, and, well, I can still put myself in alignment with some of these individuals. But the end result of all of this, again, is a self-enhancement bias that we all tend to project. This need to be seen as a relatively positive thing. And some of you might be asking now, well, is this a good thing or a bad thing? I'm sure many of you, when you hear this, think of me as kind of harping on you, saying that you think better of yourself than you probably should, and you should lower your expectations. That's not necessarily what most social psychologists have found. In fact, numerous studies have shown that things that we really value and that relate to better outcomes in life tend to be linked up with inflated senses of self. There's numerous studies that have shown that to have better mental and physical health, you need a good perception of who you are. You need this thing called self-esteem. And if you do have this positive rosy tint on who you are and this inflated perception, it can also help you overcome certain problems a little bit better. In essence, when problems arise, when you fail at certain things, you can rebound quickly if you've got this positive sense of self. Now, this also relates back to what we talked about in last week, where we talked about how we tend to diffuse the blame for failures and look towards the situation when we're looking at ourselves, while looking towards the person when looking at others. All of this can be an explanation for where the self-enhancement bias is coming from. If we're looking at why it's there, well, it tends to actually have some pretty positive impacts overall. There's also a theory out there called the self-affirmation theory that suggests that essentially when we do encounter problems, when we find things that are not necessarily giving us a rosy tint to the self, we desperately find things that we can use to affirm who we are and make us feel better, so we don't have to experience some of the mental and physical effects that sadness and these negative perceptions of the self can actually incur. And in fact, there was 2 decades of research done by a woman named Shelley Taylor who highlighted how important this positive perception of the self was when we encountered stress. Numerous studies have looked at biological and mental mechanisms to show that if you have a slightly inflated perception of the self, then you tend to not only bounce back quickly from failures, but you tend to be able to kind of regulate your body in situations that are stressful. Now, it's also important to note before we close out on this, though, that this is very culturally specific. When people in our Western, or sometimes what we call independent society, encounter conflict, encounter failures, encounter stressful events, these moments can be very challenging and kind of be perceived as an attempt to sort of slight the self or challenge an interpretation of who we are. In Eastern societies, what we sometimes call collectivist or Asian societies, we don't see these robust effects. When those individuals encounter failure or large amounts of stress, because they don't put so much value on the self, usually they focus more on social constraints, there isn't that apparent need for having this self-enhancement bias, and there isn't this need to constantly discount the reasons for failures that we see in our Western culture. And what this highlights is that because we've tethered self-esteem and self-worth to successes and being seen in a positive light, we have to work hard to maintain these things or there can be negative consequences. these things aren't tied together, if we just see ourselves as the person we are and don't put much judgment into it, there might not be the need for these enhancement biases. And all this highlights how it's not necessarily a good or bad thing when we talk about the self-enhancement bias. It's just maybe it's a necessary thing because of other components to how we see the self. You might also be asking, as we progress here, if there's differences in culture, are there also differences in individuals? Are there moments where maybe we don't want to be seen as positive, but instead we just want to be seen as who we think of ourselves as? And there's been a growing body of research that does suggest that just like wanting to be seen as positive is an important thing for many of us, another thing that's sometimes even more important is just being seen as consistent and accurate. In essence, there's a lot of research that suggests that once we form this sense of who we are, we want people to agree with that perception. We want people to say, yes, what you define yourself as is exactly who I see you as. That's what this self-verification theory suggests. And the byproduct of it is really interesting. Because even though most of us do see ourselves in relatively rosy lights, there are definite exceptions to this in our population and throughout the world, where people don't necessarily see themselves as positive, don't necessarily think of themselves as possessing specific traits that are desirable. And for those people, more often than not, when others are judging them, it's more important for them to be seen as aligning with their own self-perceptions than it is for them to be seen in a positive light. This means that when we look at individuals struggling with mental health issues, people that do have very specific quirks that they hold true to themselves, a lot of these effects that we talked about are not necessarily thrown out the window, but they're made significantly more complex. And it again highlights in social psychology that oftentimes situational factors and new constraints always need to be considered if we want to explain a lot of the different phenomena that we encounter. And this brings me to our very last topic that we're going to be discussing in this lecture that I'm noticing we are flying through. And that's how this then manifests itself in our behaviors. We've talked a lot about how we ourselves want to be seen and the things we do to try to get others to see us, but we haven't spent a lot of time talking about the actual process of getting people to see us in a specific light. This relates to a concept that we call impression management, where numerous attempts are often done by individuals to be seen in specific ways. We're going to talk in future lectures about how oftentimes when we see ourselves as giving, there's a big desire by many of us when we are giving to be seen doing those actions. When we're seen as creative, or we think of ourselves as creative, we want others to see us as being creative. And in fact, when we're in those social contexts, when that's a component to us, which we think is important, we tend to really push that in that situation, almost to a point where it's sort of awkward that we are so set on getting others to see us in a specific way that even if a comment is out of context or not necessarily pertaining to the situation, we still bring it up just so we can get that kind of recognition of people seeing us the way we want to be seen. There is, however, a slight exception to this, and it's when we're around people that we don't necessarily find desirable. And this relates to a really interesting topic of what we call social tuning, something that was explored about 15, 20 years ago and is still looked at today. How when we're around likable people, we do still want to be seen as consistent, but we also pair that with wanting to be seen in a positive light by these likable individuals. One of my favorite studies that highlighted this effect was one that was done by a researcher named Sinclair and a number of colleagues in 2005. What they did in this study was they had people participate in a sort of cognitive task that was touted as a way of determining people's racial biasing. Now, the test was definitely something that you could tweak in certain directions if you were a participant and wanted a specific outcome to occur. And this is exactly what Sinclair wanted to have in their test. So what they did is they bring people into a lab, and half the time when people came into the lab, they walked in and they saw an individual wearing an anti-racism t-shirt. In particular, it was a big t-shirt with the word eracism on it. A kind of common term that was used back in the early 2000s to indicate that there was a desire to kind of create more racial equity and try to find a way to minimize the amount of racism that was present. But in the other condition, when people weren't in that case, they walked in and they saw a research assistant that I believe was wearing a black or a white t-shirt. The important thing was that the t-shirt had nothing on it. It was neutral, was what they called it. And in addition to having this split, participants were also split in another way, where half the people, regardless of the t-shirt of the person that was the t-shirt that the research assistant was wearing, came in and were treated very poorly. The research assistant was intentionally rude. So they made enough comments to imply that the participants were not that bright, that they were annoying the research assistant, that they weren't going to do things correctly. Essentially, they were showing a lot of animosity towards the participants. And the other condition, again, regardless of the shirt that the research assistant was wearing, they were treated in a very likable way. The research assistant was very gracious, was very attentive to the people, trying to be as nice as humanly possible to come across as likable. And then again, people participated in this study. And what Sinclair found was that because people could sort of manipulate their behavior in these tests, there was a pretty profound difference in how people performed based on the condition that they fell into. If people were with a very likable person who was wearing that anti-racism shirt, most of them displayed behaviors, because they were trying to tune things, in a way that actually showed a negative bias toward actually black individuals. I'm not necessarily saying that correctly. They had an anti-black, pro-white score that was considered negative. So essentially they were trying to show that they were not only not racist, but they were kind of invertedly racist. I don't even know how to explain it. But their scores were very, very low, much lower than if they would just kind of responded to every question by chance. For the people that were paired up with a likable individual that did not have a certain shirt on, they actually displayed, and this is kind of weird, a large amount of racism. Now, Sinclair and others argued that this was actually a byproduct of the fact that the research assistant wearing the shirt happened to be white, and they essentially displayed a very strong pro-white bias just because they were with a white person at the time. I'm not sure if I buy that particular fact, but the one that they really highlighted and focused on was the fact that when people were treated rudely by the person wearing the anti-racism shirt, these individuals actually showed a pretty strong racial bias. They were more anti-black, pro-white than most controls. And that's a pretty robust effect. And in fact, to add to this, when people were in the neutral condition and they were treated rudely, they showed the strongest reverse effect. They sort of showed, I guess we could say, we'll call it a pro-black, anti-white bias. This really strong, robust effect again suggested that the situation really had an impact on the way people behaved in this test. And what people were sort of doing was making sure that their behaviors were aligning with how they wanted the person to see them. If they liked the person, they tended to conform to what they expected the person to want them to do. If they didn't like the person, they almost tried to do the opposite of what they expected the other person hoped for them to do. And all of this highlights how, when we're acting in different situations, there's a lot that goes in to not only our sense of self, but how we decide to project that self to others. It's partially because we want to be seen in a positive light that we tweak our behaviors. It's partially that we want to be seen as consistent, that we behave in specific ways. It's partially because we either like or don't like somebody and we wanted them to see us in a specific light that tweaks our behaviors even more. In the long run, the final product is that our behavior does reflect the self, but there's a lot of components that go into it when we look at how our behaviors come about. That's going to mark the end of this lecture. There's a lot of stuff that we unraveled here, so if you need to, make sure you review. But hopefully you got a sense that we covered this concept of the self in a slightly new way, looking at what it was we used when introspecting and coming up with a sense of the self, and then how malleable this self was across different social situations and what moved it, if there was something that moved it. In our next lecture, we're going to kind of continue down this path. We're going to look at how we get a sense of these things called attitudes, and then how we justify those behaviors and attitudes that we've been talking about so far. It is, however, before we get to that stuff, a very important point in the class. We do have our first exam coming up in the next module. So if you can, make sure you've not only reviewed this material, but the material from the past modules as well. And hopefully, once you've done that, you'll be ready to go and ready to really tackle that test. If you've got more questions about the exams, I encourage you to review the syllabus, and if you still have questions, reach out. Happy to clarify things. Until I see you again, take care. Good luck in your studies, folks.